This podcast was proudly brought to you by the Baby Maker program with Stacey Roberts. This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Joining me on the line today is Stacey Roberts, the Baby Maker, a former physiotherapist turned herbalist and naturopath. Stacey has been involved in healthcare since 1989 in both conventional and complementary medicine. Stacey is an internationally recognised natural fertility and women's health expert who has assisted people in over 32 countries with improving their overall health and well-being by addressing not just their physical but also their physiological and psychological health with complementary products and services. Welcome back to FX Medicine. Stacey, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you guys so much for having me back. It's always wonderful to talk to you.
Pleasure. So today we're going to be talking about an area of interest to me, somewhat controversial because people like to own things, but we're going to be talking about the microbiome in pregnancy and fertility. So if I can just first ask you, where do we start right back with fertility issues? Like I guess we need to start with diseases that prevent successful pregnancy, right?
Well, Andrew, when we talk about this stuff, I guess I want to preface it with the fact that, we have just started to, it just started to tap into the very beginning of this research. So, a lot of it is, centered around what we can talk about today is, bacterial vaginosis and things like that, which has more research on it. But when we talk about specific fertility diagnoses, as I'm doing the fertility mentoring program and the modules about PCOS, endometriosis, recurrent miscarriage, there's more and more research that's starting to be utilized or done in these areas. So we're just kind of scraping the tip of the iceberg as we talk about specific, fertility issues related to the microbiome. But and there's going to be so much more that's out there. But there's definitely in the research, the correlation with issues with the microbiome and fertility issues, whether they're cause and effect, that's, we just don't know that at this point.
I wonder if we'll ever get to a stage where we have true medical guidelines with regards to probiotics, because we like to think that we, can isolate one and then therefore that's the hero. But that's not necessarily true from one population to another, one group to another. So there's just so many things that we need to work out before we can say that is true, for instance. But things like bacterial vaginosis, group B strep infections, they have a real issue, notwithstanding that they're not medically treated with probiotics, but they certainly are bacteria that may normally reside and they're out of whack, causing a disease.
Well, some of the new research is actually pointing in the direction of women who are resistant to antibiotic treatment for BV, to utilize probiotics as a possible either along with the antibiotic or if the antibiotic hasn't been, creating the results that they want. So we are moving in that direction. I think from eventually there'll be a medical doctors recommending probiotics. At least I'm hoping that they'll be recommending probiotics as one of the first line treatments for BV because it's the most common vaginal disorder in reproductive women and results in millions of visits to healthcare providers every year. So it's definitely something that we could utilize from an educational point of view to help women understand the importance of the microbiota and their gut health as well as their vaginal health so I'm hoping that based on these studies, we're going to be starting to see it go that way.
I'm glad you said the word microbiota because the flavour of the month word is microbiome, but that's regarding the genetic material, not the organisms. And, and I think we really need to make that distinction. We're falling into this trap of saying microbiome, which I've got to say, it's very easy to do that. We fall into these colloquialisms because they roll off the tongue. But you said the right word, microbiota. I remember reading a story, and I still need to find this paper, but I remember a paper talking about the temporal progression of the various probiotics when they were recovering from vaginal infections. So I think forgive our listeners if I get this wrong, but I think from memory it was Lactobacillus iners was first and set up the shop and seemed to make the foundations for the progression that then Lactobacillus crispatus could come in, and then there were others in temporal progression. Is that right? Is that what you see? Or?
That's basically what I've seen in the research, especially what you talked about, the Lactobacillus iners as kind of that first primary one that kind of setting the stage. But I think, what we're going to find is, again, from a microbiome point of view and a genome point of view, that it's going to probably vary with populations and, where people have lived and what we're going to see in regards even to and things like that. But, that's absolutely what I've seen in the research as well, too. And there's a temporal shift with pregnancy as well. So,
of course, yes.
If it changes, the microbiome changes, the microbiota changes through pregnancy, as well as in breastfeeding, becomes much less diverse in that. So the body is, obviously doing that to prepare for something to either support the growth of the fetus and support the mother as well, or prepare for after. The body's pretty smart. So if it's doing that, it's doing it for a reason.
So with regards to the recovery from bacterial vaginosis after antibiotic therapy, which may well be appropriate, and certainly group B strep, which can have some devastating consequences if left uncontrolled, is that really the place for probiotics to recover?
I think, we've seen some benefits with probiotics along with the antibiotics as we're taking the antibiotics as well. Off the subject of fertility, I just had my son who went to the doctor because he had a persistent, what we thought was a sinus infection, ended up being a glandular fever, but we didn't know that at the time. And they prescribed an antibiotic only because I was absolutely, totally desperate to do something about this, what seemed to be a sinus infection that wasn't clearing up. But the physician also prescribed along with that the use of probiotics. And my son's mouth just about dropped into the floor, and he just smiled and looked at me because we've been talking about that since he was a little guy. Yeah. So I think in that sense, we're finding that along with the antibiotic treatment, whether it's AV or any bacterial issue, that the probiotic along with the antibiotic can be useful, and certainly from recovery. I mean, that's without question that that's been shown in research from the a diarrhea point of view to thrush point of view from antibiotics for sure. So and also, again, like I said at the beginning, is that there is some treatment for women who have been resistant to recovering from the antibiotics to actually utilize probiotics vaginally to combat the BV.
Mm. Now, what's interesting to me is, that when you're looking at research, obviously scientists want to control things, so they need something specific, and that's down to the strain level. And I have no issue when you've got, exactly what you're using, the cohort fits the patient, the cohort of the research fits the patient that you're seeing, and so you go, I want to use that strain. But I do have issues where we think, it's basically your poo's better than mine. But particularly when you get research done in one culture, transposed to somebody of a totally different culture. I have issues. And, we've seen this with, like, for instance, Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG. It was touted and it's, it was for atopic dermatitis. Actually, no. You use that in Western Australia and it fails and indeed can increase wheeze. Now, it may be that it might be that, the timing of the when you give the organism, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the hero that it was originally set up to be for that condition.
Right, across the board, and that's where, like you said, population is going to be a big impact on the results, what bugs they're exposed to in their environment, and then how the body reacts to that. So I think we're getting better there as we're looking at the genome and specific, having personalized medicine and personalized nutrition. That's certainly going to be affecting probiotics as well. But just like, trying to take the active out of the plant and make it into medicine.
That's right.
That is, going to be that active is going to be the answer. It's not necessarily the case many times. So, it's about, what colonies, what groups, what communities work best together to create the healthiest microbiome for that particular microflora, microbiota for that particular person.
One issue that interests me, and I'm not saying don't do it, I just think it's very interesting that it's standard operating procedure to give all babies a vitamin K injection, Canakian, at birth, and that's to prevent profuse bleeding tendencies 2 weeks on. Obviously fatal, devastating. So notwithstanding that the consequences of not having the Canakian can be devastating, I just think it's interesting that why have humans evolved to be vitamin K deficient at birth?
I could speculate on that, obviously, but I think, vitamin K is found in green vegetables, and vitamin K1 specifically. And what have we completely gotten away from in our diet, becoming a more industrialized society over, the last 100 years? Clearly, vegetables and all those good things that we should be eating that are very diverse in all micronutrients and macronutrients that they have. And then the vitamin K2 is, made from, bacteria in the gut. So as we're talking, about this and probiotics and
antibiotics,
microbiota, and the use of antibiotics, absolutely. That's going to then deplete the body's ability to create those two types of K1 and 2. So it doesn't, it makes a lot of sense of how we have evolved to that point, unfortunately. So hopefully it's common sense to people to, as we change that idea of how we need to eat and how we need to take care of our gut, that hopefully that improves and, maybe someday we won't need to be doing those injections.
So what do you find the facility of using specific strains? Like, for instance, I remember there was a product and it contained the Lactobacillus rhamnosus L60 and the Lactobacillus fermentum L23 for use with, actually, was that group B strep or was that bacteria? I think that was for bacterial vaginosis. Might have that wrong. Mm-hmm. Hopefully those strains are for that condition. Forgive me if they're not, listeners. But what do you find the usefulness in patients? Like, is it something that you can say, yes, it works?
That's a really good question. It's what we kind of alluded to before is it doesn't always have that same effect that we want to see across the board. So where I'm at in this whole situation is looking at, all right, what is the evidence that's in front of us? We know that lactobacillus is a very high level in the vaginal flora. It's an area that when the BV is present, we usually see less of the lactobacillus present. So, and I'm really worried at this point about the absolute specific strains and, which one is going to work and which, specific combination and how much of each strain and how many CFUs of each do we need. At this point, I just don't think we're there yet. So what I'll do is start really with the gut, really, first of all, because that's going to have a systemic impact on, on the whole person, and then look at doing things, vaginally if necessary, and heavy in the lactobacillus because that's the environment that we're wanting to support.
Well, so you mentioned diet, and look, I wholeheartedly support that. Indeed, I think that's the way that we're going to find, this sort of area progressing is at least the use of prebiotics and certain other fibres and foods and substrates to help bacteria to grow. Probiotics to grow, not restricting them to the dairy type based probiotics that we have available to us in Australia, because I think there's 14 species that we have of the plethora, the legion of organisms that we have growing in our gut. But I love the way that you say about diet. So when you're talking about certain fibres and when you're talking about fertility issues, what sort of fibres do you tend to recommend, or what sort of foods do you tend to recommend indeed?
Well, I have my 5-step fertility solution, which the number one step is optimal eating plan. So I'm going to be looking at getting more fiber, both soluble and insoluble fiber in their diet as a general rule. However, if their gut health is poor, you start to add this extra fiber in, let's say, in the form of psyllium, and sometimes that can set them back and it can become more constipated. So it's also important to assess how their eating plan is, what their gut health is at first, and then potentially, starting with some probiotics and obviously getting the sugars and things out of the diet that are causing the issues in the first place. And then slowly adding in fiber. I'm not a big proponent of doing, 40, or 50 of fiber, right away, even though that's what they're saying, we should be having in our diets. So it's more I start with their eating plan first, just to get the most optimal basic eating plan and get the things out that are causing the inflammation and causing the dysbiosis. And then, supporting that with a good probiotic, occasionally doing a cleanse if necessary, and then adding fiber if they're able to tolerate that, both soluble and insoluble.
Stacey, forgive me, I just want to backtrack a little bit to bacterial vaginosis, BV. Would you mind taking our listeners through some of the associated morbidity and indeed mortality issues with regards to BV and later pregnancy?
Sure, absolutely. BV has not been associated with decreased conception rates, either naturally or with assisted reproductive techniques, but it has been associated significantly with the elevated risk of preclinical pregnancy loss. So a person is pregnant, but before they're officially pregnant clinically, they have seen that women with BV usually are higher as far as preclinical pregnancy loss. But it's not associated with increased risk in the first trimester of miscarriage, but it can be associated with later term miscarriage as well too. So it is definitely something that needs to be addressed, and a physician needs to be evaluating this and the appropriate use of antibiotics through pregnancy as well. And from a naturopathic point of view, being able to support that from the probiotic point of view as well too.
Yeah. There was very interesting research done by Madrid University, a group there. Forgive me, Rodriguez, Fernandez. I think there was Esther Jimenez. She's one of the highlighters. And this group did research on the health of breast milk. Now, they were looking at mainly mastitis. They're branching out into other areas now, and they isolated certain strains, the Kecht strains, which they've used for mastitis. Indeed, there was some research showing that we're using, I think it was Lactobacillus salivarius, Kecht 57313, and that had better outcomes than the antibiotics and less recurrence, which is a common issue with mastitis. But what about the use of other species for the health of breast milk in general, indeed for the health of the mother during pregnancy with other conditions? And I guess where I'm looking at is practical things like, what about in later pregnancy with things like heartburn?
Absolutely. Probiotics certainly have helped with digestion. We know that. I would say all the listeners from a clinical standpoint is understanding that it supports nutrient absorption. So anytime you're supporting nutrient absorption, you're going to support improved overall cellular health, but definitely been associated with decreasing reflux and those types of symptoms in pregnancy. But also, probiotics can help reduce the risk of postpartum depression in some cases. So, there's been some preliminary research on that.
Wow.
That the probiotics alter the neurotransmitters in the gut, which, can boost the ability to deal and cope with anxiety and depression. So, utilizing probiotics to hopefully, either decrease the risk or prevent postpartum depression is, fantastic. And also there's been research about women with taking probiotics that have a reduced risk of preeclampsia as well. So,
wow.
It's just a lot of really good information out there about that. And is that bottom line because it's encouraging nutrient absorption? Potentially decreasing inflammation in the gut. We don't know exactly why that is, but they're definitely making these associations. And as far as probiotics in breast milk, one study that I found was really interesting is that women who were given probiotics throughout the pregnancy, and then the amount of probiotics in their breast milk was measured afterwards. Women who had birth vaginally had higher levels of probiotics in their breast milk than women who had birth via C-section. So again, they're taking the same probiotics, but why is that? Why is that happening in the body? But clearly, prebiotics that the human, milk has, human breast milk has with the oligosaccharides to promote the growth of more probiotics. That's definitely present in breast milk as well as probiotics. So we know that it can have a beneficial effect. I'm not sure, again, that we're there on specific strains for mastitis or anything else. But certainly it's marketed for that, in many cases. But it just, makes, it's kind of common sense, doesn't it? I mean, looking at that as a bacterial infection and how probiotics help to support optimal health and decrease those types of bacterial infections.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting is when you get researchers like Lisa Amir, and she did the Castle trial, found that we weren't just seeing that they weren't seeing the traditional culprits for mastitis, but they were also seeing Candida albicans as a sort of emerging culprit. And so it sort of begs the difference, what should we be doing to treat these women? Right. Very, very interesting stuff. So we might put that research up on the FX Medicine website for practitioners to access. So where to now with probiotics? What do you think the practical utility is? And can you give any hints to our listeners, our practitioner listeners, with regards to dosage or indeed combinations or indeed use with diet to make them more effective?
As we talked about in my other podcast, it's always difficult to give a recipe that's going to be good for everybody. So I'll give you my philosophy, and then as practitioners, we've got to decide, what's right for that person in front of us. Yep. So basically, my philosophy, as we talked about in my 5-step fertility solution, is number one is going to be looking at their eating plan. They can get prebiotics in their eating plan, fermented foods as much as they can tolerate, or if they can tolerate that. Starting to introduce that into their eating plan. Something simple as sauerkraut or kimchi or something that just they can utilize and begin to introduce. And then starting to reset the overall health of the gut, depending again on how severe their gut health is. Starting with a gentle cleanse. I don't do, very heavy detoxes when somebody's trying to become pregnant, because I don't want to upset their system and put more stress on their system when it's already significantly stressed, both emotionally and physiologically. So I'll do more of a gentle cleanse with some great herbs, and then add in some probiotics, and usually multi-strain probiotics because it's very diverse and broad spectrum. And I think it sets a good base for the majority of people. And then from there, there's other testing that can be done. You can do an organic acids test to look and see if there's specific issues with gut bacteria, and then they can give you specific recommendations based on some of the testing that's out there. They can do some stool testing as well to see what strains may be missing for that particular person if you're not getting the result from a good broad spectrum probiotic. And then, monitoring and testing to make sure that you're getting the results that you want, although it can be expensive to redo like an oats test, the organic acids test, or the stool testing. But if you're not getting the results, looking at retesting those in 3 or 4 months' time to be able to assess where the patient is at. So I'm a big proponent of following up and monitoring, and not just giving them something and assuming that it's actually going to be working, especially if they're not getting pregnant or not getting the result that they want. Yeah.
Can I ask, when you're looking at fermented foods like kimchi, notwithstanding that there's billions of Asians eating kimchi, or at least hundreds of millions, and that this is quite safe for the populace that normally eats this, what about the risk with infectious agents like, for instance, listeria? Now it's normally, we call them buffet foods and the preserved meats and things like that.
I really think it has to do with the source. So if you are making them yourself, or know of a good reputable source that you're purchasing them from your health food shop or wherever you're getting them, I personally, clinically, and I can only speak in that realm, is that I haven't seen it be a problem. The problem that I do see is that some people's system just can't tolerate it because they just, either aren't used to it. Their gut health isn't to the point where they can tolerate, even a little bit of probiotics, much less prebiotics as well.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen that side of things, Andrew, from a clinical point of view, for it to be a problem. But I certainly can't speak on the global scale of how that is impacting people. But from any type of thing with Listeria, you've got to look at the source where you're getting it from. Has it been sitting there for a while? Is it something that, looking at those buffets? Well, I try not to eat at buffets, really, because it's a little bit scary with the food sitting out that long.
Yeah. Well, I've never heard it associated with fermented foods. I've heard it with things like, things left out. And I think, exactly. Salmonella, for instance, is not Listeria, but Salmonella is associated highly with eggs. And we've seen outbreaks in Australia with that.
I would imagine with fermented foods, and I'm no expert by any means, but I would imagine with fermented foods that it has their own defense mechanism against things like that, based on everything that's going on at the microscopic level of how things are dividing and multiplying and growing. So again, that would be a great question for a fermentation specialist.
Yeah, well, I just think it's really interesting. I would think a lot of, not most, but a lot of pregnant women in Australia would say, I'm not going to have sashimi, for instance, or sushi. Mm-hmm. And yet, it's a traditional Japanese dish. Notwithstanding that there may be, preparation issues from sitting too long on a grocery store shelf. As I mentioned, eggs with salmonella before, but again, I don't think eggs have been listed as a high-risk food for pregnant women.
No, I would say, and again, we're probably talking about population there too, right? So if you've grown up on those types of foods, the body has probably created some type of mechanism against, even if that is present. Fighting against that, right? If your population, that's the majority of the foods that you're eating, your body would usually accommodate to that environment. So in an environment where those aren't the same types of foods that you're eating, that could be more of an issue. I guess looking at it from a logical point of view, but from the standpoint of understand, sometimes women who are pregnant are afraid to eat anything. They just don't know what to eat because they're told not to eat vegetables and salads and things like that because of the risk of listeria, and that so sometimes that listeria can become a bit of a hysteria.
Yeah, well, it is actually quite a rare disease, but it can be devastating for the infant. Yeah. So I think from memory it was like deli meats. I think those pre-prepared, even plant foods there, pre-prepared things. I remember like a what do you call it? Coleslaw. Your buffet meals, and
even things like soft serve ice creams.
Right, soft cheeses. Soft cheeses was the other one, wasn't it? Is that right?
Soft cheeses, exactly.
Yep.
Those types of things. Yep.
So they're the issues, not the fermented foods.
Correct. But again, that I've seen, and it just makes sense to me that if they eat healthily. And again, know where the source is of the food that's coming from, and that it hasn't been sitting out in the back of some kitchen somewhere before they served it. It's just going to be less likely to cause an issue. Yeah.
So I think practitioners, if they're going to be recommending certain changes to dietary foods in pregnancy, they just need to be aware of the level of competence or knowledge of healthy eating of the patient.
Right, exactly, and really encourage them, and this would be common sense with the majority of practitioners, encourage them to prepare their own foods, and make sure that they can monitor, what they're doing, how long the food has been out, all that type of stuff, and eating fresh, as much as possible.
So, Stacey, just in wrapping up, and I allude to a comment you made before about probiotics were used to allay some of the side effects of antibiotic therapy, and so they were given with antibiotics. And my issue, I guess, with taking probiotics is they may be useful. If you take enough, certainly. Some are going to get through, but they're very often killed. So you've got to get into this kill, replace scenario, which the compliance is diabolical with patients. Other than that, though, there's the utility of Saccharomyces boulardii. Can you take our listeners through what's the relevance of that? What's the uses of Saccharomyces boulardii? And, the research that's, with regards to safety with fertility and indeed with pregnancy?
Sure. with the Saccharomyces boulardii, how I utilize it in the clinic would be someone who has significant issues with let's call it leaky gut, which is now becoming a more commonly used term in medicine as well. That someone who has significant issues, because if all you're doing is giving them probiotics, some of the studies have shown that the lasting effects of probiotics is 2 weeks. So you take probiotics for 2 weeks, and then if you take probiotics for a couple of days, and if you do a measurement of gut health in 2 weeks, then those probiotics are not necessarily going to be there. So it's you're not just wanting to continue to replace. You also want to do and support some repair of the gut. Of the tight junctions that potentially are affected or have been, damaged from increased inflammation over time. So Saccharomyces boulardii, improving the levels of secretory IgA, helps in the repair of the gut. So you're utilizing that prior to administration of a probiotic if someone has significant gut health issues when dealing with fertility issues, but really making an extremely important point to explain to the patients why you're doing this. Because if you're not making the connection of how their gut health is going to improve their overall cellular health and that can impact hormone levels, they'll just think you're trying to sell them another thing. So really having to educate and make that connection between why the gut is important for their fertility, and then utilizing Saccharomyces boulardii and along with a good probiotic after introducing that for a bit of time, then adding the probiotic. And sometimes I'll even do a cleanse prior to adding the SB into the scenario as well. And again, it really depends on the patient that's sitting in front of you, how involved they are, and what they tolerate. So I put patients on the SB, and they have not been able to tolerate it at all. And so we go backwards or not necessarily backwards. We take a step back and look and see what should we be doing now. Let's do a general clean out. Let's decrease inflammation, utilizing some herbals, and marshmallows, great, kind of to soothe the gut as well. And then reintroducing these things. But again, educating the patient is number one about how these things are associated and how that's going to improve their fertility. Because even though probiotics are very much out there in the public domain now and people understand or at least know what they are, they still don't understand the connection of how that's going to improve their fertility or overall health or whatever that's used for. Yeah.
I remember looking at Saccharomyces boulardii, and there was I couldn't find any direct research of Saccharomyces boulardii in pregnancy. There was a couple of studies that says, but it appears to be safe. There was one that said, look, we just don't know, so you shouldn't take it. But I note that there's been millions and millions of doses sold. Some, at least, of those would have been taken by pregnant women, but I cannot find an adverse outcome from taking Saccharomyces boulardii and during pregnancy. I like to pick up on a point you made there about marshmallow, a beautiful herb. I point out to our listeners, we are not talking about the lolly. we are talking about the herb. And the glycetract tastes a hell of a lot better than the fluid extract, the alcohol fluid extract, I can tell you.
Absolutely.
Do you ever use the herb itself, the dried herb? I've never actually found it, but
I've utilized it to make a decoction and try to make something that is actually usable for myself, and it's been quite an interesting experience. It's very sticky and it just sticks to everything. So I stick to the roasted marshmallows from that point of view, as using away from tinctures or glycerates, as you said. But it is a beautiful herb to utilize for gut and digestion.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So glycetract, listeners. And what other points with regards to probiotics in pregnancy? We've covered the diet. What about things like the importance of exercise? And, I've seen this with regards to, I think it was exercise your bugs, or that exercise can affect your microbiota in a positive way.
Absolutely. And, again, I'll move back to my 5-step fertility solution because it's very straightforward. Number one is the eating plan. Number two is removing toxins. And, that's a whole another talk about how, chemicals and toxic exposure impact our microbiota and also our microbiome as well. and epigenetics and methylation pathway, on and on and on. We could talk about that forever.
Yep.
Then it's supplementation, so we've covered that, and exercise is step number 4, along with stress management, because both will exercise is a form of stress management as long as it's balanced for that person. So absolutely, there's been some great research showing the improvements of gut health with exercise and with stress management. So probiotics have been shown to improve, like we talked about, in pregnancy for decreasing risk of postpartum depression potentially. Probiotics have been shown to help. Certain strains have been shown to help with anxiety and depression, and certainly exercise, helps with those symptoms as well too. So, from that point of view, it just is such a good adjunct to the program to help support, my 5-step fertility solution, but really overall general health as well. Adding in probiotics to support all those areas. Hormonal health. There's some studies about probiotics and hormone metabolism and how it assists with that in the gut. So, and then there's the microbiota all over the body. I mean, there's a uterine microbiota, which they used to think that the uterus was sterile, and now they are detecting that there's a uterine microbiota, which may impact miscarriage or in recurrent miscarriage if that's not
wow.
enough. So much research going on.
Oh, absolutely.
About all the different areas of the body.
Absolutely. Watch this space. Stacey, thank you so much for taking our listeners through the important aspects of infertility with regards to microbiota and the potential use of certain probiotics and indeed diet. I really do. I love the way that you take people through the practical aspects, but you concentrate on these basic 10As that we should all be doing before we look at even consider a supplement. And I really respect you for that. That's great.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me again. And I look forward to our next talk.
This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Hi, I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Here at FX Medicine, we strive to remain clinically relevant. So stay in touch with us and please let us know how we're doing. We love hearing from you. You can email info@fxmedicine.com.au or contact us via Facebook, Twitter and Instagram.